So, hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of the third season of Sheltering Places, which will be hosted by myself and Evrim Bayındır, and our guest today is Arjen Kleinherenbrink. So what I will do now is I will read a brief abstract of the session today, and after that we will introduce ourselves a bit more, less briefly perhaps, and of course our guest as well. So Arjen Kleinherenbrink's recent book, Against Continuity, seeks to upend the decades of scholarship on Gilles Deleuze's philosophy. For the second episode of Sheltering Places, which is where we are now, we have invited Kleinherenbrink to participate in a critical discussion surrounding his groundbreaking interpretation of Deleuze, its connection with speculative realism, and the method that brought it all about. Deleuze's work poses notorious challenges for interpreters because of its lyricism, its ever-changing vocabularies, and the sheer extent of its close dialogue with the history of philosophy and other disciplines. So it is perhaps as a result of these difficulties that there have been remarkably few attempts to reconstruct the heart of Deleuze's positive philosophy, his ontology, and Kleinherenbrink's Against Continuity is possibly the most ambitious attempt to do so to date. And what Kleinherenbrink does in his book is that he begins from the idea that the heart of Deleuze's philosophy is the fact that all relations are external to their terms. And from there, he reconstructs Deleuze's ontology. So I will now let Evrim read Arjen's biography.
Arjen Kleinherenbrink is assistant professor in metaphysics and philosophical anthropology at Radboud University in the Netherlands. His current research focuses on the renewed interest in metaphysics since the turn of the century, especially within continental philosophy. Carl Olsson is a postgraduate geographer at Newcastle University. His research centers on conceptual constructs linking self-consciousness to the earth in philosophy, psychology, and literature. He is also a certificate student and researcher at the New Center for Research and Practice.
And aside from myself, Evrim, who just spoke, is a researcher and certificate student at the New Center. His research interests include phenomenology, Deleuze, and speculative realism, with a special emphasis on the concepts of temporality, spatiality, consciousness, origin, domination, and autonomization. I should just note that Arjen has also, as you should be able to see on the screen now, has also translated for the New Center one of Deleuze's perhaps earliest seminar that is in existence, which is called What is Grounding, and you can go to our website and find it there. So with all that said, I would just like to say welcome to Arjen, and I think everyone will begin to ask with our first point of discussion.
Okay, so I begin with the first question. Arjen, throughout Against Continuity, you are arguing that Deleuze's speculative realism and object-oriented ontology are not derived by projecting these movements onto Deleuze's work, but only by revealing the essence of his works by way of a meticulous textual exegesis. This allows you to situate yourself completely outside the Deleuze scholarship that is characterized as a whole by an unawareness for Deleuze's fundamental project of developing a flat ontology of external machines or objects. What you are basically saying is that you have discovered the essential principle of Deleuze's philosophy, which is the externality thesis. And this crucial point has been missed by everyone who has read Deleuze until now. It is thus of no surprise that speculative realism and object-oriented ontologies do not have an indispensable role in your book. All the speculative realist and object-oriented philosophers are restricted to the intermezzi, without which the main body of the book wouldn't lose anything from its coherence and structure. What is more, you present Deleuze not merely as a forerunner to speculative realism and Tripolo, but as the most advanced version of them. The only function of these intermezzi is to compare Deleuze with these later philosophers and provide the reader with the opportunity to conduct further research. However, since your book is written after the appearance of these movements, we will never know if it could be written before their emergence. One is then tempted to ask what your reading of Deleuze owes to speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Do speculative realism and object-oriented ontologies have an impact on your reading, apart from their secondary role for comparisons? Or to put it another way, does Deleuze have anything to learn from speculative realism and object-oriented ontologies?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, Evrim. I think yeah, there's a lot in there. So let me first say this. Of course, I hope that my book is not completely outside the Deleuze scholarship. I mean, there are others, of course, who many others who agree that Deleuze is a very systematic thinker that can also be systematically written about. But I do think that, you know, the claim of the book, as you said, Carl, is that there is this idea that runs throughout Deleuze's work from beginning to end, that relations are external to terms, and that when you look at what that means and how that is explained and treated in the text, that you end up with an ontology in which, you know, reality consists of all kinds of entities across all kinds of domains and levels, and each of those entities is irreducible. So the association with speculative realism, and especially object-oriented ontology, is the idea that Deleuze is ultimately not this philosopher of a, you know, spontaneous, bubbling, process-like virtual realm behind or beyond or throughout all things, but a philosopher of individual objects, entities. So then, of course, what does that have to do with speculative realism and object-oriented ontology? Because if you're, you know, a very unfair critic could say, you know, you read too much of these guys and now you try to retroactively interpret Deleuze in that way. So there's two aspects to that, two answers basically to that question. One is a bit biographical, which is mainly of interest for me, but I'll tell you anyway. And the other is more about the content of things. So biographically, the book came out of my dissertation work, which started in 2012 and lasted until 2016. And for the first 2 years, I had no idea that speculative realism or new materialism were even things. I did my work, I'm at Radboud University in Nijmegen, which is in the Netherlands. It's not the heartland of continental philosophy. It's not even the important part of the Netherlands. It's not near Amsterdam and Rotterdam, so everything arrives a bit later where we are. And I'm also from a faculty where you get very, very classically trained, right? So much of my undergraduate student studies literally was a lot of scholasticism, reading Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and all that stuff. So we arrived late to the party. That's part of the excuse. But I did have this idea. That was the initial idea. The setup of the dissertation was to try and figure out Deleuze's metaphysics. And my point of departure was at first things that I was interested in difference and repetition, but especially in the lecture about difference and repetition. That's published as, I think, the Method of Dramatization in the Two Regimes of Madness essay collection, where Deleuze basically had to go to some French society for philosophy and explain what this tremendously difficult project, difference and repetition, was all about. And he explains very clearly, well, I think, he says, that every object is divided into two halves, each of which is again divided into two. So that gives you a fourfold, right? An object with four aspects: parts, qualities, differential relations, and I think singularities. And regardless of what those things mean, you know, he says, well, my project is about seeing objects as divided into four, you know, features, four aspects. And that also, you find those kinds of references all the way up to the later works, right? So if you know Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus, there it's also not just the idea that the world consists of assemblages, but also that assemblages are tetravalent, which is simply a fancy way of saying there are fourfoldy, there are four aspect-ish. So that was what I was working with. I was trying to reconcile these like metaphysical ideas throughout Deleuze's works, and not just the big ones, but also the small ones. So in the second edition to Proust and Science, right, this, the 1972 edition, at some point at the very end, Deleuze also zooms out and says, okay, so what kind of world are we describing in here? And he says, well, it's a world of closed vessels that don't communicate. And if you read the dialogues somewhere around, like in the beginning of dialogues also, he says, well, if you take this externality thesis thing seriously, right, relations are external to terms, he says, well, then you get a Harlequin world, like a patchwork, right, like the kind of stuff that a Harlequin would work, right, where you all have non-totalizable fragments that communicate only over vast distances, that kind of talk. And I was trying to make sense of that. And then 2 years in, I remember being at my sister's place. She was also, I think, already doing her PhD. And she's like, yeah, this Deleuze stuff about metaphysics and entities and swarms that you're always going on about, I might have some stuff that relates to that. And she lent me 2 copies, well, 1 copy each, of Meeting the Universe Halfway by Karen Barat and After Finitude by Quentin Mayassou. And I thought both of them were awesome because both of them on their covers, they had like the universe on it, like galaxies. So that's a big part of that is the reason why there's ultimately spaceships on the book against continuity. And I started reading that and I was like, yeah, this is the kind of continental philosophy that I'm interested in. And by, you know, then starting to look for their names, that's after 2 years into the research when I found out that Levi-Bryan didn't just have the book that he had, A Difference in Givenness, about the more exegetic side of Deleuze, but also the democracy of objects and ontocartography. That's when I found out about Tristan Garcia's work, Marcus Gabriel's work, Graham Harman's work. And because you told me the kinds of questions that you were going to ask, so I looked it up. There's this website, bol.com, which is basically Dutch Amazon, and that's where I've been buying my books forever. So I could see when I bought the first speculative realism books, and it was May 2014. The first week of May 2014, I bought Form and Object, the Quadruple Object, and wait, I can see it here. And no, there's 2, Form and Object and the Quadruple Object. So then I thought, okay, this is great. I'm not an idiot. There are other people who think in this direction, but by that time, big chunks of the thesis the dissertation had already been written. But at the end of the road, I did feel kind of obliged in the dissertation that wasn't yet the book. The original dissertation was called Machine Philosophy, and it has nothing about speculative realism or object-oriented ontology in it. But there is one thing that I added I think it's called a note on Graham Harman's philosophy, and it's 1,000 words in 100,000 words thesis where I simply try to notice, well, it's a lot of coincidence here that, you know, I'm trying to tell you that Deleuze has this idea of entities being fourfold structures, ontologically speaking. And now there's also this American guy, Graham Harman, who is obviously not a Deleuzian, but he claims kind of the same stuff. So that's how that came about. Initially, there was no link whatsoever. But then, as time went on, I did ultimately, in the same year that I finished the dissertation, I did publish a Dutch book on metaphysics called, in translation, called Everything is a Machine. And that primarily uses Michel Serres. That's the primary reference in the book, because as you may know, Michel Serres also sometimes speaks in terms of reality as a polymechanism, and he also thinks that every entity can be understood in terms of 4 features, namely sending, receiving, transforming, and storing. So that was the Dutch book, that's where I go all out and say, okay, well, Deleuze, Michel Serres, and some of these object-oriented ontologists are basically saying the same thing. But that was, well, phase 2, basically. That's the long answer.
I think it's a very nice answer. I should just note that sort of I take your note in about the Graham Harman's philosophy to be a bit sort of a reference to the note that Deleuze has in different repetition about Heidegger, that it perhaps plays a similar
yeah role. That's the joke.
Yeah. And there's some irony there, considering that Graham Harman comes from a kind of Heideggerian perspective.
Yeah, and also maybe I should add, and that may also be a quirk of where I was trained, but at the faculty where I was trained, the idea when you're writing a dissertation is really that you write about your primary material, and you don't exit too much into associated genres or secondary literature, which you do of course read, but you must always, we all know when you're writing a PhD, there's always this danger of not becoming a secondary author, but a tertiary author, who only writes about everything that has been written about the source material. And if you start doing that, it becomes very hard to describe, to make clear in the text what you actually understand about the primary materials. So there was also this kind of institutional training built into me where I automatically wouldn't exit too much into other sources that you find.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very important because it kind of maps into my what I was going to ask you, and I think sort of since this generally since this session is so sort of oriented around Deleuze, I think it's nice to kind of bring a question that are a bit more kind of general. And I think one of the things that is very interesting to me about your work is the method and the kind of, you say that you're conducting a reconstruction of Deleuze's philosophy. And in this sense, I do think that there is kind of, even if you were to say that kind of my introduction was a bit inflated perhaps, but I do think there is something genuinely new in what you do, insofar as the way that kind of speculative realists such as Graham Harman and kind of this object-oriented ontology thing, the way they do ontology and what they sort of try to think about kind of goal of ontology being, I think there is something new about that. And I think it's very interesting that you reconstruct that kind of ontological thought through Deleuze, so kind of in Deleuze, kind of discovering what a sufficient ontology would be at the heart of Deleuze's thought. And so I wonder a little bit if you could say something more about your method of reconstruction, both kind of what separates it from something you could take to be very related to it, such as sort of interpretation or something like that, and also on a very practical level, how did you actually sit down and do this? As you know, that question about reconstruction makes me feel a bit caught in the act, even though the book was 4 years, well, the dissertation was 4 years ago, the book was 1 year ago, because that's what I've been calling in all my books, also the Dutch ones, what I do, like I reconstruct ideas. And coincidentally, when I received your ideas about questions for this session, I also noticed that in the work of two master students that I'm supervising, that they're also now calling what they do reconstruction. So now, for the first time, I have to somehow think of what that means. But I think I have an answer. I know I have an answer, and it's up to you to decide whether or not it makes sense. But again, so from my institutional background, like all the standard ways of reading and writing that are familiar in continental philosophy, hermeneutic approaches, post-structuralist approaches to texts, deconstructive approaches to texts, differential readings, and so on. For me, in terms of my background, that was only a very, very small part of what I was doing, right? Because in my undergrad studies and my graduate studies, there was just as much analytical philosophy and history of philosophy as there was continental philosophy. So there was simply not the option of saying, I'm going to do a deconstructive reading of anything, because you had to write in such a way that people in other sub-departments could also still understand what you're doing, right? So that also, that already puts some pressure on you to really think about, okay, what do I think that I'm doing when I'm writing text, when I'm doing philosophy? And it's not that I have but let's just say that I depart from the idea that, quite simply, some of the interpretative strategies that are prevalent in continental philosophy and in some Deleuze scholarships are just that. They are interpretative, and they treat a text as if you're looking at a work of art, where the idea is, I think that's what
Frederick Jameson says about Deleuze, where he says, well, there's not one system. There are infinitely many or numerous systems, or as many as you want. Or even Foucault in the introduction to L'Anti-Oedipe, where he says, well, this is no longer classical philosophy. This is perhaps a work of art, right? It's not just us subsequent generations. It's also, you know, the primary French guys that themselves play with this idea. Oh, maybe philosophy should be treated as a work of art. And I think there are simply too many differences between a work of art and a work of philosophy, even though you can always push the boundaries. I mean, let's be honest, you can always push the boundaries, but there are a lot of significant differences. And most importantly, I think that a work of philosophy, or even science, but let's talk philosophy, right? Walks you through the argument, right? It gives itself to you step by step. More importantly, it also constantly reflects on itself, right? It summarizes itself every now and then. It tells the reader after 50 pages, like, okay, this is what we have achieved, and you should think of it as this and that and that. And then finally, and I think most importantly, as a third point to why I call it reconstruction, the vast majority of philosophical works also engages in arguments as to why other, let's say, paths towards other arguments are dead ends, and why competing philosophies are wrong, and why possible objections to an argument just made would not be valid. And that's something that art doesn't do. I mean, yes, Tolstoy adds this big kind of appendix to War and Peace, where it's like, well, you know, this was a nice story, but here's, philosophically speaking, what I want to say about agency and human freedom and so on. But that's very, very rare. And it's even rarer for example, when are you going to see a painting? Imagine a Picasso that is about how all other styles of painting suck. I mean, what would that be? So philosophical works are much more informative as to what their content actually is. So when you're writing about a philosopher or a philosophical book, what you're doing is not interpretation that is in any sense that would in any way be comparable to what you're doing when you're experiencing a work of art, either as a layperson or as a somewhat more advanced interpreter. Right? So what you're doing is you're trying to find out, when you reconstruct a text, you're trying to find out, like, okay, what is the spine of this text? And sometimes there are 2 or 3 spines to a text, right? There's no text is under the obligation to be about only one thing. But philosophical texts, in my view, simply have this aboutness, and you're trying to find out what their conclusions are meant to be, what they're working towards, and then you're trying to reconstruct or reverse engineer why these arguments that come before the conclusion are there, how they were put in place, whether or not they are valid, whether or not they hold up. And at some points that even becomes, you know, this kind of standard exercise where you remember the syllogisms that you were taught in undergrad school, and you're like, okay, I'm not literally going through my syllogism list, but I'm going to want to find out whether or not this argument is really supposed to be here, whether it works, whether there's a possible objection that wasn't foreseen, and so on. So in sum, the too long didn't read version, it's reconstruction simply because philosophical texts give you many more clues as to how they're put together than we sometimes acknowledge in continental philosophy.
Thank you. I think that's a very good answer, and I think there's something about how the kind of the method of reconstruction and calling it that makes it very possible to kind of disagree and sort of to say that if one were to think so, that you are wrong, and sort of have a kind of fruitful disagreement and actually get somewhere.
That's another point, right? And here I completely agree with Quentin Meillassoux when he says, well, the big trap, the big risk for continental philosophy, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, is what he calls fideism. Fideism ultimately being the idea that the only reason why, if we 3 all write a text about, let's say, différence et répétition, that the only ground on which we could disagree with each other would be political or social in nature, and that there's no argumentative rigor that goes beyond that, that there's no real test to be done, no trial of strength that we could put our readings to the test, to the text, and then see who's right. I think that is very much a live option, even in the weirdest kind of continental philosophy. And otherwise, what are you going to do? Like, I mean, many of us also teach. Like, how are you going to grade students if there's no ultimate ground in the text to find out if people are right or wrong? But also, and here I will also admit that I'm not a firm believer in the whole idea that the author is dead. I mean, people don't sit down and just throw things on paper that they happen to think about after pondering Nietzsche and Bergson and Freud a lot. I mean, people actually have a plan when they write a book, and more often than not, it's visible in the book.
Thanks. So my question, since you mentioned Meillassoux, my question is at some point somehow related to him. So one of the central ideas of your book is that externality thesis necessarily presupposes an act of withdrawal, which characterizes the virtual reality of every single object. Objects are external and irreducible to their relations because they have withdrawn themselves, both from these relations and from other objects. According to your reading, a necessary consequence of withdrawal is that the very withdrawn aspect of objects cannot be experienced and known. Does this not mean that the very object of thinking remains absent to it? Your realism seems to be a realism that restricts access to the real. This position might be contrasted with Meillassoux' idea that real or in itself is both radically separated from and still accessible by reason. Your criticism to Meillassoux was not because he was a realist, but because he was positing an ultimate relationality or a false height, which is the hyperchaos, as something superior to the objects. What we would like to ask is that, do you think it would be possible to experience and even know this radically separated aspects, just as in Meillassoux' case, but still secure the machine thesis? Can there be machines that appear in absolute contingency, as you explain in your book, withdraw themselves from the rest of the universe, and that nevertheless can be accessed by reason or some other faculty without reducing them to their relations? A shorter way of formulating the question would be, can there be a non-relational knowledge and experience of machines, and what would it look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. Well, so just to get, because here I see the risk immediately, you know, when I say that Deleuze says that objects withdraw, immediately people think, no, that's Graham Harman, that's not Deleuze. But if, for example, that's where when I first started using that word was after the close reading of Logique du Sens. So if you take Logique du Sens, on page 5, it says, you know, what am I going to do with all this kind of Stoic metaphysics? Well, the idea is that one body withdraws from another, as a liquid does from a vase. Se retire. And that is a verb that keeps recurring throughout that text, very much Deleuze's own. So then you get into the problem. I mean, as you know, I more or less subscribe to the Deleuze's idea. I think that what defines a machine or assemblage ultimately is a set of powers or capacities, or what he calls puissance, that need not be exercised at this very moment, right? I have the capacity to speak French. I'm not speaking French right now. That's the difference between the capacity to speak French that I don't manifest, and the capacity to speak English that I do manifest right now. So the question then is, if these powers never manifest as such, what does that mean for knowledge, right? And it's a bit disappointing, but I don't think there's a real problem, because I think the problem disappears as soon as you do not think that knowledge needs somehow to be a clone of the object that it is about. right? So I think that there are many ways to accurately describe the powers or capacities or puissance or whatever you want to call it of objects without somehow having to make them fully present. And part of that is because what knowledge is, or what cognitive work works towards, is something that in English probably you would have to call descriptive generalization over cases, right? So let's say that you have a small pet. Let's say you have a dog. The dog behaves in certain ways, but at some point, after observing it for a certain period of time and in a certain amount of situations, you start to use words that don't really describe what the dog is doing right now. You will say things like, oh, this is a very friendly dog. You can pet him if you want. Or, oh, this is a vicious dog. You should absolutely stay away from this dog because they're terrible. And words like friendly or vicious describe the inherent character of the dog, right? They don't describe their attempts to do that. They don't describe the parts of the dog. You're not saying that the paws and the tail are vicious, but the snout is somehow friendly. And you're also not saying what the dog is doing right now, because you're warning somebody, you're telling somebody exactly about what the dog is not doing. They're not yet manifesting the friendliness or the viciousness that will be manifested as soon as you approach. And there's a lot of those kinds of words like that describe, let's say, that are dispositional language that we use to talk about things. And I think that when dispositional language gets it right, then you have a real, true statement about the inherent features of an object, its powers. But that kind of pits me and also Deleuze, as I present him, against a lot of others, right? So this would be absolutely anathema to people like Wittgenstein or Ryle, especially Ryle, right? Ryle would say, like, no, whenever you're uttering dispositional words, you're just describing behavior in weird terms that suggests that there's a ghost in the machine and that there's somehow an inherent somethingness that doesn't manifest in reality, and that's total nonsense. But contra Ryle, I would say, well, yes, that's exactly what we're trying to do when we're trying to gain knowledge about an object, rather than its parts or its effects. We're trying to describe it in, let's say, dispositional terms. And I would try, and I think that is exactly what Deleuze is often after too. So to refer once again to the Proust book, right? A big part of this Proust book is about the question of what is a jealous lover? And to leave many details aside, I mean, it's obvious that this jealousy is his inherent disposition. That's how he acts in the world. That's really him. His jealousy is not a part of him. It's not the jealousy of his left foot or his right toe. It's the jealousy describes how his powers keep manifesting in various series of behavior in the world.
Yeah, but still one of the things that is not easy for me to grasp is that you are arguing that the virtual inner reality of the machines can be thought. We can speculatively deduce the fourfold structure of machines, but we can not in any way experience them. So there is a gap between thinking and experience.
Yes. So I would say maybe that helps. So I think that, so if you have a more classical position where you think that knowledge can really make the being of a being present, if you think like that, then knowledge and an act of thinking that yields knowledge is subtractive, right? You cut away, you trim the fat, you cut away every appearance, and you get to the essence. You know, if you're a Husserl, you would say, you know, that's when you get to the that's the eidetic reduction. That's when you get to the eidos, the real qualities that are essential to the object, and you make them present, which is possible in principle. Not according to all Husserlians, but it seems to be the case. But I don't think that knowledge is subtractive. I think knowledge is additive. I think that an act of thinking, and that's also why an act of thinking is always a risk. An act of thinking is generalizing over a series of cases, right? I mean, it's the same for experimental science, right? You have your series of interventions or alterations or observations or data, and the act of knowledge is to add something to that, is to say, well, you know, given all these manifest appearances or whatever you want to call it, what do we have to conclude about our research object? And that's precisely why conclusions in science, but also in philosophy, are falsifiable. Well, not in that sense, not in the strictly Popperian sense. That's not what I want to claim. But why you simply can be wrong about your object.
So you are saying that thinking proceeds by subtracting the
adding.
Is it knowledge? You are saying that knowledge proceeds by adding.
Yes, by adding something that, so there's not that it would be opposed to this kind of Platonic theory where a real act of knowledge is somehow getting your mind back to the ideas that it used to dwell with in the beyond before, you know, all the terrible contingencies of the world befell you. So here actually I'm quite on board with Mayasu when he says, well, that reason, I mean, of course, not in the dirty details, but the idea that reason can have access to, at the very least, the ontological structure of things or reality. I think that is very much a live option. I mean, otherwise, what are you doing when you're doing metaphysics, right?
I'm very glad that Evrim asked this question and sort of about epistemology, because I think that's often one of my issues when I'm reading kind of the object-oriented ontology broadly, that it kind of, so how do you know this? So there needs to be some kind of idea about what knowledge is for it to make sense at all to me, for it to be useful. And the usefulness of this is something that I think is quite interesting. It leads to something very interesting, because right before this session, I think I kind of want to bring it up now. You suggested that we sort of say something about the COVID situation and Deleuze, perhaps. And I think that's also interesting within the context of sheltering places that began as a kind of response to COVID. So I am personally quite hesitant about the kind of applicability of this kind of philosophy. And I think in the beginning of during all the lockdowns and the general panic that sort of ensued, there were a lot of these quite criticized responses by different philosophers. I think most infamously Agamben, who wrote these things that everyone sort of jumped on him for writing them. And I wonder a little bit sort of what in a kind of a fun experiment, what do you think Deleuze would have said? And also more generally, perhaps, do you think is the usefulness of philosophy generally, or perhaps ontology in particular, to since that is what your book is dealing with, perhaps, and as a ground for saying something about sort of things that are going on, such as COVID and sort of these kinds of events. What is it good for?
Well, what is it good for?
No, I know. Yeah. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Sort of what do you think? Yeah. Sort of.
Well, one thing would be, of course, that let's just say one thing that struck me very much in the Netherlands. I don't know how it was in other countries, but there seems to be like this generational divide, where, roughly put, if you look at the news media in the last couple of months, philosophers who are older than 50, they all seem to want to be very eager to warn us about this kind of Foucauldian danger. So the state is coming in, and all these measures that are so-called, for your health. Yes, we are not crazy. We are not conspiracy people. Of course, they're trying to help, but this is giving them a lot of power, and they're going to use this as a pretense to, gain more control over your privacy and your health and your degrees of freedom in the world, and so on. And under the younger generations, and I don't want to insult anyone, but under younger generations of humanities people, let's say, the response to that was like, really, you still need Foucault to say that? I mean, come on, that's a knee-jerk reaction by now. I mean, let's say the terrible way of putting it, but let's say the news value of that isolated kind of way of thinking, like, oh, the government is going to get you. I mean, yes, you don't need Foucault to tell you that this can, of course, serve as a pretense for the government to solidify its grasp on whatever, or big corporations, and so on. So what use is it? Well, initially one would be pessimistic, but on the other hand, if you're talking about this particular situation, like one thing that I find especially interesting is let's say the increasing popularity of Bruno Latour inspired analyses, right? So there's this famous book by Annemarie Mol, The Body Multiple, which among other things is about diseases, and it takes kind of this Latourian perspective where it seems to suggest that, you know, there's no such thing as the same disease as a natural kind, right? There are only, let's say, family resemblances between various diseases, but each manifestation of a disease, each case, is a completely different kind of actor network. Because of course, if you get, let's say, something terrible, cancer, and you are very religious and you think that God is punishing you and you have to live that within that religious context, then that is a very different disease that you seem to have in terms of what you are suffering, what you are going through, is something different, or at least not identical to another situation in which you get, say, cancer, and you are completely secular and you have a completely, you know, biologically reductionist view, or, you know, these are just cells messing around in my body and I'm going to get treatment for that. And if you see how such texts sometimes even make it all the way up to, you know, where they are discussed in policy contexts, then of course, if you're asking what use is it, well, then you have the immediate consequence that, well, you know, ultimately some philosophers lead to some philosophical theories are ultimately things that lead people to make certain policy decisions. So there I do think that, you know, even the most kind of so-called abstract ontological or metaphysical theories do have their own relevance, especially in times like these. Not in terms of that, you know, that I would now say, well, if you read the fifth chapter of Difference and Repetition, you can easily derive a 7-step program of what you have to do. But, you know, I was thinking about this earlier today, and there is this, of course, this famous Deleuze text, The Postscript to the Societies of Control, where a lot of people have said, well, you know, here he tries to kind of develop Foucault's idea of disciplinary power, and he tries to take it one step further. And sometimes that's interpreted as, you know, in a control society, there's no big bad guy telling you who you need to be, like a drill sergeant or an authoritarian teacher. But in a control society, there are all these subtle mechanisms whereby you kind of pacify yourself. But that's not true, simply because that's already in Foucault. I mean, Foucault was not an idiot. Foucault knew very well that discipline works best when you're doing it to yourself, rather than a system having to put all kinds of time and energy to kind of drag you against your will into the school and be like, ah! No, discipline works the best when you yourself want to be, you know, a student of a certain kind, a soldier in a certain way, a family man in a certain way, and so on. But what is new in control societies, maybe, and this is just maybe because I don't know, but I'll read the thing where he says, the conception of a control mechanism giving the position of any element within an open environment at any given instant is not necessarily one of science fiction. And here it comes. Félix Guattari has imagined a city where one would be able to leave one's apartment, one's street, one's neighborhood, thanks to one's electronic card that raises a given barrier. But the card could just as easily be rejected on a given day or between certain hours. What counts is not the barrier, but the computer that tracks each person's position, licit or illicit, and effects a universal modulation. So the difference here seems to be that in a classical disciplinary society, whatever institutions and power mechanisms there are rather static. They don't change that much, right? The army is still going to be the same 20 years from now. The hospital is still a hospital 20 years from now. But in control societies, there seems to be this possibility of a day-by-day change in where you, with your credentials, can and cannot go, what you are and are not allowed. I mean, as a Deleuzian, you would also almost say that the world is a bit more schizophrenic in a control society than in a disciplinary society. And I think that in this pandemic, this is a very familiar situation for a lot of people, that part of the stress that you're under is the uncertainty of, are the rules going to be the same tomorrow? About the efficacy of a mouth mask, about how much distance you should keep. Can I go to work? Can I not go to work? Okay, I cannot go to work. Can I go do sports? Okay, I cannot go do sports, but I can go to the barber. 1 week later, I cannot go to a barber, but I can do sports, you know? Can I travel by train? Well, maybe only if it's an emergency, and maybe not. And these are things that change so fast that I think that is perhaps an excellent illustration of the difference between a control society and between mechanisms and institutions as functioning as pertaining to control society logic versus disciplinary society logic. So the advancement, the way that Deleuze tries to advance the argument coming from Foucault, is perhaps this idea that the very institutions that are exercising control could become things that change much more quickly, that are much more dynamic, that are much more unpredictable, and so on. Brian Masumi actually wrote a book about that called Ontopower, and it's like, you know, Brian Masumi is kind of a Deleuze guy, where he says, well, you know, the kind of world that you get is a world where you simply cannot predict behavior as easily as you could in the bad old days, because the only real power that you have left is something like response speed, because you know that things are going to change. You don't know how they're going to change. So the only real skill basically to have is the capacity to adapt really quickly to changing situations with all the stress that brings with it.
Do you mind if I reply quickly, Evrim?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay, yeah. No, I don't want to take up too much time. I think sort of the hidden kind of assumption, or sort of what comes before what I said, which what good is it? Is that I'm coming from a kind of social science background where these kinds of ontologies have proliferated in recent years, and I'm slightly I wouldn't say suspicious, but perhaps I am a bit full. In terms of being sort of, and sometimes you end up with claims that someone is, now I'm exaggerating, it's quite grossly, but it's a new materialist, object-oriented ontological Deleuzian, Latourian framework, and there's this big and mix kind of thing. Yeah.
If that is your thesis, you need to take out some stuff. That is too much, Carl.
Yeah, no, exactly. But you kind of run into that. I feel sometimes, and I think when you sort of turn to control societies, Deleuze is saying something very sociological in a sense. And I wonder, my problem is precisely when one is doing these kind of ontological inflations of what one is trying to say, and so I'm kind of grounding one's analysis on an ontology, because to some extent I do think that ontologies are committal in the sense that you cannot just take one and then sort of just let it go, and because then what you're doing then is you're applying an analytical lens, and that's to me something very, very different. And so I wonder a little bit, to what extent would it have been possible to write the control societies text, for instance, for Deleuze, without sort of having that founded on the externality thesis or something like that, if that makes sense? To what extent is an ontology more generally sort of necessary in order to be able to say certain things? And I think this is my issue with a lot of the
Well, I don't think that one necessarily has to write every paragraph of one's philosophy in light of a already developed ontology or metaphysics. That is perhaps that's a rule that I use for myself, but I wouldn't dare generalize it for others.
No, I agree.
But what I do think is that certain philosophical claims, and then I move away from the postscript for a bit. So, for example, if Deleuze has this whole kind of swarm of concepts that he introduces, for example, indifference and repetition, right? It's about a new notion of ideas. There are three syntheses of habit, of disjunction, of conjunction. There's this notion of singularities, there's this notion of multiplicities, and so on. If you're asking, why does this make sense? It's not empirical science, so you cannot point at reality or a database or a set of observations done in the wild or in a lab where you can say, well, obviously Deleuze had a either good or bad rendering of what he perceived in the lab. So what else is there when you're doing philosophy at a fundamental level, right? Well, then there is this idea that your concepts need to be grounded in a theory of what the world is like, right? In a theory of how things hang together within whatever domain you're talking about, right? Doesn't need to be metaphysics. Could also be political philosophy or ethics. But if you want to write a philosophical ethics, right? Then ultimately what that has to be, whether or not that stands up to scrutiny, I think is the proper term, whether or not that holds up under scrutiny, well, that is determined by whether or not your arguments are coherent enough, if they're grounded in something really strong, because otherwise you're just some person with their own opinion. And then, like you say, you can have this parody of people who would hypothetically say, well, this is a neo-Deleuzian object-oriented new materialist reading. But that, of course, it means nothing unless there is something strong at the level of the argument that actually holds up. But also, I think when you're talking about work in the social sciences and the humanities, I also think that in those cases, the proof is typically in the pudding, right? So if you say, well, I'm studying shipping lanes between Europe and Asia and their impact on how languages spread to port cities, are you going to do an actor network analysis, yes or no? I don't know. Like and Latour also doesn't know, right? The philosopher doesn't know. The person who knows is the researcher who writes this methodology paragraph, and you submit it to either your professor or a funding committee. And then you have to be, well, part lucky and part smart enough to have written something where they say, well, yes, if you do it like this, that might have merit. But then whether or not that works, if your actor network theory analysis or your object-oriented ontology analysis actually has any kind of explanatory power, the only way to know is to do the work and to run the risk of terrible failure where you throw away 3 years of your life trying to apply Latour to obscure port cities. It happens. I'm sure you're not doing port cities, right? This is not your research. Okay, cool. And I think that, like, one of the things that to just add one thing to that. Can I do that? Is there time? Yes.
Yeah, sure. We have time.
One thing to add, I do think that, I mean, we've all experienced that. I mean, there's always this idea where as a student or when you're writing your dissertation, you have to somehow get with the program. You have to figure out where the field is at. And then there's always this kind of waste bin, no, it's not a waste bin, this entire arsenal of methodologies, and somehow you're 20 something and you're just still figuring stuff out, and somehow you need to know which kind of methodology is the most suited one for whatever you're going to do. And then also there's this pressure to choose whatever is the hot shit of the moment, right? I mean, that's also another problem.
So, yeah, well, one of the questions I had in my mind, it concerns about how to use your work. For example, the problem I was thinking of was the production of the new, and your machine ontology places great importance to how something new appears. Mm-hmm. And this problem also had critical importance in the Deleuze studies as well. So the production of the new is effectuated by the third synthesis, the conjunctive synthesis, or the eternal return. And the eternal return is the ultimate thought experiment that allows us to actively participate in the genesis of a new entity or a new machine, in your terms. I wonder how your discontinuous ontology can change our relationship with the eternal return. What are the concrete differences that can take place if we experience the eternal return or the production of something new, whether in social field, in politics, in arts, in thoughts? If we experiment with the eternal return within the framework of the externality thesis and machine ontology, what new your work brings to the production of the new?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll answer in terms of the production of the new, for the simple reason that one of my professors was a very influential Nietzschean, and I don't dare talk about Nietzsche because I hear his voice kind of judging me in the background. I'm from a Protestant country, after all. So the production of the new, so that insofar as I'm philosophically interested in that, much of that ties into another part of my background, where I'm not just a philosopher. I also used to do business school, and I used to be a consultant. And I mean, if you look at your average consumer product, they're always advertised as completely revolutionary and completely new. Even the most banal things like shaving cream and other everyday household items, they're always shampoo, they're always revolutionary. The new generation is much better than the last generation. And if you look at management literature, like business school literature, I mean, it's amazing how dominant this idea of everything having to be disruptive innovation is. Even within management literature on sustainability, ironically enough, and on green practices and on corporate social responsibility, the idea is that whatever the solution is going to be, it has to be new and it has to be disruptive and everything has to be unprecedented and it has to make people gasp in awe as to how new this all is. And I think that one of the nice things that you get once you start thinking in terms of a more Deleuzian mindset, or object-oriented ontology for that matter, is that you start to differentiate between superficial manifestations on the one hand, and let's say real alterations in the core of the very being of things on the other hand. And this is something where I'm not just, where I don't just appreciate Deleuze a lot, but also Graham Harman's little book, Immaterialism. Not little in the sense of superficial, since it's simply short, where the point is that, well, if you really want to know what an institution or an organization or a product is like, you want to hunt for the limited amount of symbiotic events and changes that really define what it is, rather than try to map the entire play of differences that is constantly, of different superficial encounters and manifestations that constantly happens. And I think that there's something to be said for that. So let's say you want to really understand what is the new thing that the Apple Corporation brought to the world, right? Steve Jobs. And then on the one hand, you can you can reconstruct the entire series of new stuff that they've introduced, right? The first Apple, the second, the third, what are they up to now? The iPhone 96 or something? No, it's the 12, right? I'm not an idiot. It's 12. Let's say it's 12. Let's try to say that. But on the other hand, you could say, well, what makes for the particular style or character that this entity has, and with which it kind of tries to imbue all that it does, and thereby infects the rest of its world. That tries to affect everything that it comes in touch with. Actually, this is an idea that goes back to Gabriel Tarde, right? The big one of the big inspirations for Latour. Well, where Tarde says that every entity has this kind of avidity, where it tries to attune its entire surroundings to it constantly. And I think that these kinds of analyses make for kind of slower work, slower kind of research, where you're trying to not follow every jittery new thing that your research object does, but you try to ponder, like, what is it that really characterizes this thing that I'm trying to study? What is the novelty there? What is the novelty that was originally introduced in the world once this thing started, and that kept going and going and going throughout all these different manifestations, right? And I'm not saying that one would be more valuable than the other, right? But I just think that there is sometimes this underappreciation for that second kind of slower and probably more reflective, probably more speculative work, where, for example, you would try to write, like, what difference did smartphones make to the world? What is the difference that the internet makes to the world? What is the difference that this pandemic makes to the world? And where you try to accept that ultimately that is going to be a very short list of things that nevertheless, a very short list of features or effects that nevertheless bleed through in 100,000 ways in a million different settings.
This is also very interesting, because it sort of highlights the different ways there are of doing research. And I'm kind of going to resist the urge I have to ask something more about sort of ontology and explanation in the different sciences, for the moment at least, being, because I haven't really formulated a good question there. But instead, I'm going to ask you, because and it kind of relates to what you just said, sort of, what role do you think the history of philosophy plays in Deleuze's thought in particular? But I mean, Deleuze is known for having written these quite sort of concise and clear studies about a range of philosophers, two studies about Spinoza, Bergson, and Nietzsche, and so on, and Leibniz. Yeah, I can't prove. Yeah, I'm almost mentioning all of them. Because I think, and perhaps linking this back to how the history of philosophy features in your work on Deleuze, because for me at least, I think Deleuze is always, or at least it appears to always be, articulating his own positions in relation or in dialogue with his sort of heroes of the history of philosophy. And I think it's difficult, for me at least, to be able to sort of neatly extricate what Deleuze is thinking sometimes and what he's saying about Kant or Spinoza or whoever. And I wonder, sort of, how does this sort of, whatever you think the relationship with the history of philosophy is, how does that relate to your method of reconstruction?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's a very good question, because one typical thing that you see a lot, and I happen to have seen it with French colleagues, so in my head it's a French phenomenon. It's probably not, but you would have colleagues who would say, well, I'm doing my dissertation on Deleuze, and then it's 5 chapters. Chapter 1, Descartes. Chapter 2, Leibniz. Chapter 3, Hume, and so on. And then it becomes a historical reflection on authors that ultimately influenced Deleuze. And I'm saying that because there's this, you know, with this kind of often like more historical approach in continental philosophy, especially when compared to analytical philosophy, there's this risk of ultimately slipping from the author that you're writing about to their historical predecessors. And the way that I try to address that, but also again the way that I was taught, is by simply ignoring those predecessors. So anything that's in, and that's a methodological decision. Anything that's in Deleuze's book on Bergson is simply what Deleuze thinks about Bergson. And if you're writing about Deleuze, it's not interesting whether or not Deleuze's book on Bergson is correct. That's a different project. That is the project of, to what extent do I think that Deleuze got it right when he was writing about Bergson. But if you're but if you're interested in how Deleuze thinks and what kinds of arguments he makes, it simply suffices to read his Bergson book, his Spinoza book, and so on, and simply accept that that is what he thinks about those authors. Even in a worst case scenario, it turns out that this Spinoza guy never existed. This entire book, The Ethics, is a fiction that just exists in Deleuze's mind. These books refer to nothing. It wouldn't matter, simply because the book on Spinoza is part of what Deleuze thinks. And if you're figuring, and again, it would very much matter if you're actually interested in how Deleuze read Spinoza, and you are also going to read Spinoza, and you're going to compare everything and retrace everything and so on. But it's very important not to conflate those things.
But do you think it's always sort of immediately possible to sort of extricate the one from the other, though? Because many times, I have a sense that sort of Deleuze is saying something about Spinoza, but actually he's speaking in his own name. It's not such an easy sort of. Deleuze is not an author who kind of prefaces whenever he changes kind of who or what he kind of claim he's making. Yeah. And I think there is sort of in studying Deleuze in particular, I think there is sort of a very big, not a danger, but sort of there's always this sort of negotiation one has to do.
Yes, yeah. That's
I mean, you can't disagree if you want to, but
no, I agree. But again, that was the luxury of my project. It was that it was very much aimed at reconstructing Deleuze qua Deleuze, and not qua his historical predecessors. So one thing, and I think it's always also in the introduction of Against Continuity, is that one thing that I try to do is that I only refer to the historical works if they repeat or clarify arguments or claims that are also present in, let's say, difference and repetition, logic of sense, and so on. And one very clear example of that is in difference and repetition, when you, for the first time in Deleuze, are confronted with this second synthesis idea. Deleuze has this whole thing where he says, well, if there's a present, there also has to be a particular kind of past, but it has to be a kind of past that is a past that differs from how you normally think of the past, because how you normally think of the past is simply a present that is no longer present. And when you're trying to figure out what the hell that means for the first time in your life, then of course, almost the exact same thing appears in the Bergson book. Then of course you can safely use the Bergson book and you're pretty much guaranteed that, oh, look, what Deleuze writes here in difference and repetition expands on what he writes earlier in his book on Bergson. So I've been looking for, in what I did for this particular book is simply look for those correspondences and those points where they're so strong that you think, oh, okay, these things have to be related. If they're not, then I accept that I'm an idiot, because then I can do no more.
One last question I have in my mind is, your book is marked by a devalorization of subjectivity and thinking in the face of this prioritization of ontology and objectivity. So I was thinking, while reading the book, I was thinking, what is the status of thinking, the ontological status of thinking itself in your machine ontology? Mm-hmm. And in the last chapter, you give an answer to that. I will read from your book. It is on page 261. nothing in this is exclusively human. Human existence does not imply an ontological rupture with the formal structure of fourfold beings and threefold synthesis. The progression from inanimate assemblages to living beings, to sentient beings, and then to reasonable beings can only be an increasing intensification of the irreducibility of entities to their generators and generations. So even the emergence of thinking is a relational phenomenon. It's a secondary phenomenon. It doesn't imply a radical rupture in the fabric of reality, right? So, well, I find this argument really interesting, and I wonder how you actually come to this point. It seems that this is the necessary and the natural consequence of what you said until that moment, because you say this throughout the end of the book. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me that you didn't reflect on it enough, and I wonder if you have anything more to say about that, because this relative devalorization of thinking will have consequences, right? As a philosopher. So I wonder what else you would want to say about that.
Well, you are right that it's you're completely right that it's underdeveloped in the book, and that's also one of the from early readers of the book before it was published that kind of read along. That was the big thing that came up again and again and again. So if you want to play the ontology game, then you also are more or less obliged to play the put the human in the ontology game. Like where are we? What role does thinking play? And I could dodge the question by saying that this is a book that I'm working on, because I am. But to be very brief, I think that, one thing that I won't agree to is this kind of is the kind of idea that Mayasu would have, where he calls it an advent, right? The emergence of life in the universe, in the galaxy, in reality is advent. And then the emergence of thinking, or at least sentient or conscious, whatever you want to call it, life from life is another moment of advent, by which he basically seems to mean it happens and there is no reason that you can give for it. There's no account that you can ever make of how that emerges that will ever be satisfactory. No account will ever do. That seems to be the idea. I don't agree. So what I try to express with the paragraph that you just read is the idea that I think that not only does thinking emerge from obviously non-thinking animals and non-thinking matter, but also that this is a process that can be tracked in principle, if not in fact, and that in that process you will not find grand ontological ruptures where you suddenly discover, well, this kind of gap between humans or something that humans can do and everything else in existence, and then you have to decide that the difference is so incredibly huge that you have to bow down to what Mayasu says and say, well, yeah, this is advent, we cannot explain this. And obviously this is not an argument. It's not even a prelude to an argument. This is a hypothesis that I'm working with. But one thing that I will say is that in this kind of more Deleuzian machine ontology way of thinking, the problem is not the classical problem. The problem is not how does thinking bridge the gap between us or thought or consciousness and everything else, right? Because in Deleuze, everything functions by gaps and fits and malfunctions, as he beautifully writes in the first chapter of Anti-Oedipus, right? Between any two machines of any kind, there is this problematic gap. And there's always this requirement of effort and work and a bit of luck for things to hang together. And I think that when you start to think about subjectivity and thought and so on, and consciousness with that kind of an ontology as the framework in which you try to develop your thoughts, then you get quite different solutions from the classical solutions, because the idea is no longer how are we the sole exception to a world without gaps. No, the task becomes to describe what is particular about the gap that we in thought, when thinking, experience between ourselves and whatever it is that we think about. What is the particular nature of that gap as compared to other gaps that exist?
So kind of almost a philosophical anthropology based on an ontological commitment.
Yes. We are in Nijmegen, we have one of the very few chairs of philosophical anthropology in the world. It's a very German and Dutch phenomenon, and that happens to be the research group that I'm part of. So yes, that is going to be, that project is the philosophical anthropology that would emerge from a very particular kind of object-oriented philosophy. Yeah. But
that's actually, yeah, that's one thing. I mean, I think that kind of maps onto what we talked about before about explanation and so on. You have this ontology, and then you kind of try to figure out what it implies for different things. So if the world is like this, we can describe the gap between humans and everything else.
Yes, so, but also because you don't, because it in an object-oriented framework, it becomes impossible to reduce human beings to anything else. So you can no longer say, well, I'm going to understand human beings in terms of language use, because we cannot be reduced to linguistic entities. You're going to do the same for power structures or knowledge practices or discursive practices, or however you want to call it, right? So some of the, let's say, popular options within research inspired by continental philosophy in the past few decades to understand humans in terms of text or language or power and so on, suddenly look less complete, right? Less sufficient in terms of accounting for what it is that is so peculiar about human beings, if anything. So I think that ironically, this what do you call it? Trend of new metaphysics that has been going on for 2 decades in continental philosophy now, ironically opens up the way for philosophical anthropology as well, to ask the classical question, what is it that we human beings are? And of course of course you can open the question while still leaving behind all the bad old answers. There's no need to introduce the, all the failures that we have seen in the past.
This really resonates me, because I think you're absolutely right, and this is kind of what I'm working on, and not so much questions about port cities. So no, but I absolutely agree. I think the possibility of kind of tethering a renewed question of the particularity of the human being to the kind of new metaphysics that are emerging is very exciting, and I also think we can do so in seriously within the social sciences, using older such as a kind of a commitment to scientific realism, and by way of Sellers and so on. And I think that, yeah. So the thing is that when one does apply these ontological things, of course, a scientific realist would also be committed ontologically. But the problem is, of course, that one tends to, it's always going, whatever one has to say after that is going to be dependent on what ontological commitment one actually has made.
And on this point,
one can very easily, I can see a future where that leads into a lot of things being said, and then we figure out one day that, well, actually, and then that's for I think for the sciences, that's a very risky and difficult place to be. It may be very different for philosophy. I think we might eventually get a question from the audience, but in the meantime, I'm going to ask you to. You mentioned something briefly now with sort of your forthcoming or your next book. But what do you think there are any other kind of gaps in in the kind of general ambit of speculative realism and this kind of philosophy that things that it can lead to, but we haven't really seen yet? Or what is next, basically, both for yourself and for this kind of area of thinking in general?
For myself, one of the recent things I did with a friend of mine, a friend and colleague, Simon Gusman, who's a Sartrean, but we did a book on adventures. And we are currently doing a book on alienation. And then he is going to do a solo book on authenticity, because he wants 3 things that start with an A: adventure, authenticity, and alienation. But in the adventure book, as well as in the alienation book, we're trying to look at these concepts from, well, on the one hand, an existentialist, but on the other hand, let's say a speculative realist lens. So for me, but that's my Dutch work. So for me, the trying to apply the insights from the metaphysical part of the work into various contexts, that's very much something that happens in, well, not in English for me. And in my English work, what I'm working towards, and in Dutch, I'm also working on a book on Latour, and then in English, what my next thing has to be a book on either a power ontology, so a more detailed account of what it means when you're trying to describe entities in terms of their powers or capacities, disconnected from Deleuze this time, because I don't want to spend 40 years, debating all the ways in which my book doesn't conform to Deleuzian orthodoxy. I mean, I know. So that's those 3 things are in the works. As for speculative realism in general, I really don't know. The one thing that I can say is that I every year I have more research master students and more PhDs that you see that want to work on things that are quite directly, that are just about or are related to either new materialism or speculative realism. So in terms of the enthusiasm amongst younger generations of researchers, everything seems to be fine. But there too, I might be in a peculiar position, because I know that there are, of course, conflicts and disagreements between all of these authors, but us being in the backwoods, basically, we are too far removed from everything to experience these conflicts directly. So for us, it's just things are coming at us and we're trying to see what we can work with.
This is also very, very interesting, because I think we had a kind of preparation meeting for this from anyone who's watching, and we talked, and you talked a bit about sort of your departmental context and sort of where you said something in the beginning of our conversation today too about this. But I think it's very interesting to be from a kind of as a methodological level to be working in different contexts. So I don't know if you just want to briefly return to that and sort of how did you actually manage to, or how did sort of your working space and the kind of your workplace impact your ability to do this kind of philosophy? Because I think there is something that's something to be said about it.
Sure. Like one thing that really helped me in writing the book, and I recommend anyone who's doing a PhD that they ask their supervisors to try and get the same for them, is that in the final year, I got to teach a group of 20 master's students, and I could do it about whatever I wanted to. So I did it about the book. And that really helps, because then you have 20 very smart people in the room who are going to criticize every step, because that was the deal we made, you take. And that really helps you make your arguments. That helps you understand much more of what it is that you think you know. It also helps you to sharpen your arguments. And in my case, most of those students, even though they were at master's level, like the last year of graduate school, had never read a word of Deleuze. Right? And some of them had never read a word of continental philosophy except some Heidegger and maybe Husserl, right? And that, I think, when you're writing a book, is crucial, that you have people who are reading your stuff that are not yet the editors of whatever press you're going to send it to, if you're going to do that, but you have people reading along with you that are not at home in your vocabulary, who are not at home in your particular concerns, who are, of course, part of your field. I mean, for me, they had to be philosophers in some sense of the word, of course, because otherwise it would have been too abstract. Because if you don't have those people, you don't know if you're building this kind of weird echo chamber for yourself, where you're just riffing off your own ideas and it goes nowhere, and all of a sudden, you're writing a book that's just as crazy as well, Lyotard's libidinal economy or something like that, and everything becomes incomprehensible. So I think that is, again, that one of the, if there are good things about the book, many of them result from the fact that I'm in a context where I'm talking to peers who are not into the same jargon. And I think that can be a saving grace for anyone in the humanities.
Yeah, I mean, particularly perhaps in relation to Deleuze, where we sort of, there's a tendency that we end up talking about deterritorialization or bodies without organs quite a bit without actually clearly defining what we are actually
about. Yeah. So then somebody asks, like, what is a multiplicity? And you say, oh, it's a system of differential relations and singular points. And you go, oh yeah, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking like, I don't know how long I can keep this up. When you get imposter syndrome, you're like, oh yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's been there. And just to say though, I think what you're saying, I find it very cool, because, and I do think that the News Center in many ways fulfills this niche for a lot of people, and having this kind of space where we are subjected to people coming from vastly different backgrounds, and just not always perhaps critiquing our own work, but I think there is room for that. And I don't know if who's watching, but maybe there's room to develop that part of this kind of aspect of the News Center, because I think this ability to meet people who come from different fields is very useful without sort of having it under a rubric of interdisciplinarity that that sometimes just becomes a catchword, and you talk about interdisciplinarity but actually you don't really do anything. So it's better, sometimes I just think it's better to just toss the word and just go on with talking to different people. And I think it's just generally, I think it's very easy to not do that when you're based at the university and in your department, and you're sitting comfortably with your peers and trying to work on your own stuff, and you talk to people who work also on port cities or philosophical anthropology or whatever it may be. So I just just have to say I'm very sort of excited about this kind of intellectual spaces emerging, and there being the opportunity for having those in different contexts for different people.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that you immediately notice when you start to do that is that you have to, and I think that's a very good thing, you have to severely limit the amount of material that you're discussing. Because with people from different backgrounds, you really have to say, okay, we're going to talk about one problem today, or today we're going to talk about one text. Because if you have, let's say, 20 people from vastly different backgrounds, and then you start exploding into kind of this, neutron bomb of references to Derrida and Kristeva and Butler and Lyotard and Sartre and so on and so on and so on, then everybody is frantically Googling in another tab, like, what are they saying? Downloading books, cultural effing through them, trying to find out what happens. So I think that and that's nice, because I think that quite often what you see is like what are some of the really like insightful texts that you read is when an author really concentrates on a quite small sample of materials that they're going to write about. And I think those are often the best pedagogical moments, the moments that you learn the most from, when somebody really shows you in detail what happens in a certain text or in a certain case or in a certain data set or whatever.
Cool. Evrim, do you have anything else that you want to sort of bring up?
I think I asked all the questions I had in my mind.
Cool.
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
To come to an end, but Arjen, if you have some final thoughts to add.
No, I have no final thoughts to add. I think that I really liked the conversation. I really liked that you that you invited me for this, the production of the new invention. I'm still thinking about that. Yeah. No, but I thought this was great, and I'm very, very grateful to have been on the what did you call it? The series, the show, the initiative. Yeah, I know it's called Sheltering Places, but what is the noun what is the category that you put it in?
I was thinking about that too when I was trying to describe it to a friend, and I actually couldn't sort of figure it out.
Let's call it a program. Let's call it a program. Thank you for having me on the program.
Yeah, thank you for coming and
thank you very much. To me personally, it has been very useful to talk to you and sort of. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah, cheers, and see you again some other time.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.